Okay, what I mean by conjuncture. Conjuncture, you can think of it as everyone has to tell a story about how to say, in order to tell a story about an event, you have to make an effort to divide history according to period, different period, right? So conjunctural analysis means you have to try to describe the period of the event that took place, or in other words, the context. To understand the event, you need to contextualize that event. So conjuncture basically is about a period where different social, political, economic, and ideological. I think it's important that all these terms are social, political, economic, ideological. It's not just to make it sound good, but it's very important for Gramsci. Okay, Gramsci feels that. I guess here from time to time I will just point out why Gramsci is different from normal Marxist thinkers. Because the traditional Marxist thinking is that everything comes back down to class, right? Why people fight for a certain political issue, it all comes back to your position in the class system in society. That is the traditional Marxist view. But Gramsci disagreed with that. Because Gramsci said that a person's identity is not determined only by economics. It's also other things like ideology, your political beliefs, or even your social identity background. So you can think of it as Gramsci consider that Marx's view is too simplistic, too unrealistic about what actually goes on in people's lives. So a conjuncture is when all these social, political, economic, and ideological contradictions, they produce a crisis that is being experienced by the people who are living through that period of history. And I think it's very interesting that he has this term called the organic crisis. An organic crisis is do I need to have translation about crisis? Everyone knows what crisis means? You can think of it as the most simple is economic crisis, right? When the 1997-98 East Asian crisis, or the most recent 2008 global economic crisis, right? But that's economic. But there are other types of crisis of social identity, or I can say the umbrella movement in Hong Kong 2 years ago. You can say that is a political crisis, right? It was expressed in political form. So Gramsci's point is that crisis, sometimes it can be short periods, but sometimes it can be very long. Decades, can be 30, 40, 50 years. So we cannot think of just like economic crisis. Usually it's being expressed as a 2-year period or 3-year period. But in Gramsci's point of view, crisis are many forms. It can be ideological, it can be economic, it can be political. And each of this sphere can have different time frame. So you can have a political crisis that lasts 1 year, but it's actually a 30-year social crisis. It can be an economic crisis of 2 years, but another 5-year period of political crisis. So again, he also complexified the notion of crisis. It's not just like how Marxists think, if the world comes into a global economic crisis, then the left wing can have a chance to take over the situation. That's the most, of course, simplified way to say how traditional Marxist people tend to think. So Gramsci would say, no, crises have many forms, and sometimes they take place at the same time, political, economic, ideological, and social, right? And sometimes it can take on a very long period of 30, 40 years. So I will say later that Malaysia's case, per se, is like a short political crisis since 2008 to, some will say, until the present. But But I'm trying to situate the conjuncture that per se also fit into the longer period of social crisis of Malay identity. That is I would say one of the key arguments of my presentation today. In Malaysia, the easiest way to notice there's a crisis is the last 2 elections. Okay, every 5 years or 4 years we have general election in Malaysia. So the last 2 major elections was 2008 and 2013. So the next election is due by 2018. Okay, but what I mean that by this legitimation crisis or crisis of representation, which also is a term that Gramsci uses, is that imagine the political parties that are dominant in the system. Suddenly some of these parties is disconnected from their traditional voting base. Maybe I'll express it in a different way. Example, the Taiwan election, which I know very little about, so please correct me if I'm wrong, right? Early this year, the elections happened in Taiwan. You can say that the younger generation of Taiwanese, they don't feel connected to the traditional parties. So that's why there's a space for New Power Party, for example, to express the ideals or ambitions of the younger generation of voters. So I'm saying that in Malaysian case, the old formula for 50, 60 years, how each party used to have a traditional support or voting base, that kind of connection is cut off, especially the non-Malay voting base. But anyway, to bring us further along the story, I'm just saying that the UMNO Barisan National Coalition they have won every election, but in 2008, for the first time, for the benefit of my Taiwanese friends, I just want to say a bit about what happened. 2008 is the first time in Malaysia's election history, the ruling party failed to get 2/3 majority of the parliament seats. Okay, 2/3 meaning 66% of the total seats in parliament. Imagine about 220 seats. Usually the ruling party have 80% or 90% of the total 200 plus seats. But in 2008, they cannot even reach the 66% because 2/3 gives the government total power to change or amend the constitution as they wish. Yeah, so 2/3 is a magic number in parliament. You can change the constitution, the basic law of the country. So all the time, for 60 years, they can change it any way they want. But finally, in 2008, they cannot reach that target. And not only that, Malaysia have 14 states, 14 provinces. The ruling party, they lost 5 out of 14. So the opposition parties, a group of smaller parties, they managed to win 5 out of 14. 5 states all became opposition coalition governments. So that was never before in Malaysian's history. And 2013, that trend or that trajectory or direction, it basically continued in the same direction. In fact, at a national level, the ruling party even did worse. For the first time, in terms of total vote, they only got 48% of the total vote. That means if you add all the total votes of every single individual voter in the country, maybe about 12-13 million registered above 21 years old voters, they only get 48%. The opposition coalition received 51%. But why is the ruling party still in power? Because elections are not fair. Yeah, that's to put it another way. The districting of the election areas is not fairly distributed. So another context, what Gramsci want to change is that the way election district is divided is very unfair. So you have, say, as I mentioned, 220 parliamentary division. Some places only 3,000 voters. So 3,000 voters in one district, you have one representative. Some places it can be 100,000 people. 100,000 people, say in a city centre, you only have one member of parliament. But some rural area, maybe 3,000 people, you also vote for one. You get one member representing the district. So the ruling coalition, they win all the small rural areas, but the opposition parties, they tend to win in urban areas with 80,000 or 100,000 population in those districts. So to cut the story short, the national popularity has dropped, but still they are in power because of unfair electoral rules. Okay. In order to understand per se, as I mentioned, I need to tell a bit of history. To understand why I say this political crisis or social movement of per se is actually, it belonged to a more historical crisis that Malaysia is going through. And I want to talk about how traditionally in Malaysian social studies, there are two schools of thought, to put it away, in a way, two different framework or paradigm to study Malaysian politics or Malaysian social studies. So the first dominant framework is what is called the pluralist or ethnic dimension. Now this is the most common interpretation for social studies about Malaysian situation. So when I talk to, say, my Japanese sensei, supervisor or professor, or a lot of people say, oh, Malaysia, your problem is just about different race, different ethnicity, too divided, Malay, Chinese, Indian. So yeah, it's all about racial difference. So that's one framework to study Malaysia, is to say that Malaysia's system ultimately is just about racial identity and the differences between this identity. Number two, the second major framework is class, influenced by the leftist or Marxist model. So they will say that Malaysia's problem is ultimately about class difference. Working class, capitalist class, or the political economic interpretation of the country's system. So you have this also, actually, to make it more interesting, it's usually a mix of these two. They will say economics controlled by Chinese in Malaysia, right? Very simplified, yeah? They will say Chinese control the business and economy. Malays control political power. That is the very standard formula to explain Malaysian system. Malay race, they dominate political power and the structure. Chinese are dominant in economics. But as I will show, it's clearly not true. It's oversimplified and doesn't understand how things have developed since the 1970s. And I want to say also that even though there are two major schools of thought, they share common assumption or a common way, sort of like basic assumption. One is that during the British colonial period, which was in the 1800s to until independence of Malaysia in 1957, a lot of British scholars, they describe the Malay people as being lazy. Okay, this traditional picture that the native people, Malays, they are lazy, therefore they are economically behind all the other racial groups. So this image is very strong in the colonial period. And also the idea that Malays are economically backward compared to other racial groups. And secondly, they also understand who is considered have more progress and who is more backward is based on this modern idea of progress, right? We like to I was having discussions with my host that when I visited Indonesia recently, it's very hard for me to break out from the very modern, the way we have been, how to say, influenced in our thinking. We go to Indonesia and say, oh, look, they are so poor. Developing country. So even the term developing means what? We divide the world by first world, second world, third world, based on this modern logic of who is more progressive and who is more backward. So I'm saying that this kind of logic is actually based on modern thinking, which is also tied to the colonization period. They came to Indonesia, came to Malaya. They also applied this modern way of thinking to segmentize society. Who is the economically progressive? Who is the backward group? And I want to challenge this common assumption in my presentation.